Good afternoon, everybody. Buenas tardes, todo el mundo. My name is Sofia Marticorena, and I am a senior here at FIU, double majoring in criminal justice and psychology. And I am also with FIU's Jack D. Gordon Institute's Intelligence Community Center for Academic Excellence. I am a scholar in the analysis track. And my research here in this fellowship focuses on how MS-13 is leveraging encrypted telecommunications to bolster their human trafficking pipeline in the Western Hemisphere. So it is my absolute honor to introduce the next panel, moderated by Dr. Inga Trauthig. Dr. Trauthig is an assistant research professor at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. She is a security studies scholar and has received her Ph.D. from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. I'd also like to introduce the speakers of this panel. Guerra, he is with the Niskanen Center? Niskanen Center, thank you. And Adam Isacson, he is with the Washington Office on Latin America, as well as Dr. Betilde Muñoz-Pogossian. She is a senior advisor to the Secretary General of the OAS. So this discussion will examine the growing concerns of irregular migration and its implications for effective policy responses in the Western Hemisphere. It also highlights the emerging and significant national security challenges for the United States. I look forward to this panel, and let's give a warm round of applause to our distinguished guests. Thank you.
Well, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. Our students are extremely well prepared and take a lot of work off our plates, because I was prepared to introduce the panelists, and now this has already taken off my plate, and I don't need to pronounce the various different names of our esteemed speakers. So we can dive right into the topic. I'm completely objective and unbiased sitting on this panel, but I do think it's one of the most important topics we're tackling these days. And I want to ask one question to all three of you, and your answers are going to set the scene and form the baseline for the rest of the conversation. And that is, from your perspective, what is the biggest national security threat coming or stemming from irregular migration in 2026, so very current? Dr. Betilde Muñoz-Pogossian.
Thank you, Inga, and thank you, FIU and the Gordon Institute, for the invitation to contribute to this discussion. Hopefully a very interesting one, connecting security, migration, and the added element of human security, human rights, which is something that I have a mandate and I've been working on at the OAS for a long time. I also am very happy to be back to my alma mater. I did my PhD here at FIU. With Dr. Gamara, who I hope is also around here, Dr. Arraraz and Dr. Power, so it's awesome, awesome. I have very good friends here, and thanks for the invitation. So I think the question you ask is very helpful to set the stage for the conversation we're going to have, and I think I have to start by saying something perhaps more general about migration trends in the Americas, right? And two key characteristics that are very helpful to understand some of the questions we're going to discuss. Number one, that migration nowadays is not really an isolated or, let's say, an isolated event, something temporary. Now we see that migration is actually a structural characteristics of the region. We are seeing unprecedented levels of intra-regional migration. Just to quote some data from the International Organization for Migration, there's around 300 million international migrants globally, and our region captures 26% of those 300 million migrants. So it's not small numbers, and it's also ongoing, like permanently happening. And the second element that I wanted to also start by saying is that what we are observed with these migration trends in the region is that we see mixed movements or combination of migrants who do so for economic reasons, asylum seekers, refugees. We have an important element or phenomenon of internally displaced populations. And this is important to know because we're talking about different legal statuses, different protection needs, but all using usually the same routes of trajectories, let's say, or routes of migration. And all of those putting pressures on countries and thinking of migration as a multidimensional phenomenon, countries of origin, transit, destination, but also, and you know, as we see with recent policies in the region, countries of return migration, which is also a different a whole set of challenges that come. So if you ask me what is the biggest hemispheric challenge, I would say is managing this complexity of migration systems in the region and in a context of uneven institutional capacities within countries and between countries, you know, and of course this is a multinational phenomenon, and with the added element, which has been the center of the discussions here at the conference, sophisticated transnational dynamics that we're seeing, right? And then I'm sure we're gonna go in depth on that, but let me very briefly touch on these three elements. On the issue of human rights or human security, what we see is that people are on the move, all these mixed flows, where protection is very limited. This is very high-risk situations where, you know, they're subject to violence, exploitation, extortion, human trafficking, right? And again, these are not incidental risks that happen to happen around the route, but are inherently part of migrating irregularly. The second is the institutional dimension. As I mentioned, you know, this is putting a lot of pressures in all participating states, and states are expected to manage borders, absorb the arrival of these populations, process asylum claims, provide documentation, work on receiving communities. So these demands are happening all at once and in different depths. So this is already challenging in regular migration dynamics, but when movements are mixed, they're sustained over time and continue to happen, this is more challenging. And the third element, the increasing role of international organized crime. You know, this has been, I was here all day and I've been hearing how capable they are of adapting quickly to responding, you know, to changes or pressures that may come from security forces in the different states. They operate across borders, they use technology, and really what we're seeing is that this has become a business. You know, moving people throughout the region is becoming a business. Some data from UNODC confirms that migrant smuggling is around a $6 billion business for this criminal network. So if we talk about challenges, the challenge is not migration itself, but this complexity added with uneven capacities and the increase of transnational crime activities. So just to close, you know, three ideas that I wanted to start with for the conversation from the OES perspective is the need to think of these processes as from a multidimensional perspective, which I think has also been a common denominator in all of the discussions, where regional cooperation takes an important role facilitating exchange of information, facilitating the coordination of responses, and also, you know, thinking of innovative solutions to provide legal pathways to migrants. And, you know, we can talk about later about some good experiences of regional cooperation that are happening in the region. The second thing, the vulnerability, and think of vulnerability of migrants, irregular migrants, not as a human rights issue only, but also as a security strategy. And I hope we can talk about that a little bit more. And then finally, to understand that, or let's just say that we have to recognize policy paradox, and you know the panel is about policy responses, that restrictive migration policies, when not accompanied by legal alternatives, legal pathways, do not necessarily stop migration because the root causes continue to be there. But what happens is these restrictive policies which may be needed, but they have the potential to create less secure routes and associated security risks.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think it has become clear already how complex the whole situation is in 2026 and in this hemisphere. We have junior scholars who work on some of the things you mentioned, encrypted technologies and how those are exploited. Definitely JGI, the Jack Gordon Institute, is on that. But for our panelists, Adam, maybe you can go next. Sure. Answering the same question, but I know you're also an expert in like mapping migration patterns. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's something you can already tie in. But if you want to give the general answer to like what's the biggest national security challenge regarding irregular migration, please.
Let's give it a go. Yeah, the biggest security challenge with migration, let me just start out by saying it's not an invasion, right? A lot of official statements lately have justified cracking down on protection-seeking migrants by saying that the United States faces an invasion. I think that's a pretty deep philosophical difference. Many of us do not see families unaccompanied children, people coming to seek work as invaders. However, when you do have large moments of migration, like we did during the Obama and the first Trump administration, during the Biden administration, yes, it's hard to know who's coming. And you could have people who want to do harm mixed in with that population. And that, of course, is a security problem, but not an invasion. In fact, it's more of a consequence of a lack of coordination between countries and a lack of adequate management of processing and adjudication of migrants when they arrive at the United States. So nowadays, I would actually put in first place on the list of security issues organized crime. Organized crime throughout the region has really played a huge role they've really taken over along much of the migration route. It's almost impossible to make your way to the United States or another destination without having to make pretty large payments to organized crime. And if you don't, you face great danger. That also is a consequence of a lack of cooperation between states. It's a consequence of a lack, or I should say, a widespread impunity for state actors that cooperate with organized crime along the way. How many cases have you ever seen of prosecutions of state officials in any country who have colluded with coyotes and other people who are smuggling migrants? And it's become so lucrative that it really rivals, doesn't exceed, but rivals narco-trafficking and illicit mining on the list of top income streams for organized crime in the region. A lot of the same cartels, a lot of the same roots. Kidnapping has become an enormous human rights issue too, the ransom kidnappings that really go on without being properly investigated in far too many cases at all. It is a top human rights issue in the region. Now, there is less migration now when we talk about current trends. Right now, we are seeing the fewest migrants coming to the US-Mexico border out of any year since the mid-1960s. And that is because there is no such thing as protection-seeking migration right now. There's no such thing as asylum because a January 20th, 2025 presidential proclamation suspended the right to asylum. That has been overturned at the appellate court level, but it remains in place as it continues to go through litigation. That plus, I think, people have smartphones. They see the same news we do. They know that there is a climate of fear for many in the undocumented migrant population here in the United States, and they don't want to face that when they come here. So what we've seen is a drop to almost zero in protection-seeking migration, which had been the majority of the migrant population during the last several years.
Okay, thank you. So Gil, now you're the third of our esteemed panelists and need to add something to this. Regarding the question of biggest national security challenge regarding irregular migration, is there something that you would like to add, or you want to move on to the next question?
Sure, I'll add a little bit, and I'll talk about my area of expertise, which is extra-hemispheric migration and the role that technology plays in this a little bit. First of all, thank you very much to you for doing this. Thank you also to Betilde, and also to Adam, whose work has been really formative on my career so far and is first rates, even if our perspectives oftentimes differ, as I'm sure will become apparent throughout the course of this panel. The thing that I see really as being one of the main challenges going forward is the fact that I think a lot of the ways that we have understood migration to work, a lot of the schemas that we have about how we respond to migration, I think are quickly becoming outdated. You referenced, for example, roots causes, and that has been the dominant theory of both why people migrate and also how we respond to it. I think that one of the things that is very challenging about this particular time period and the kind of migration that I have seen and studied is that due to the changes in technology and how people process and access information. If you think about the development of social media technology over the past few decades, it started out being very text-based. You had MySpace, you had Twitter early on where people could see and read things, which is not very inspiring if you're, for example, if you're trying to picture what life is like in another country and you read a report about it. So you don't have that good of an example of what life there's actually like. And then in the mid-2010s, you saw a change in social media technology to being more picture-based. So you had Instagram, you had Facebook. All of a sudden, if you can see photos of life in our country, that makes you think, okay, well, maybe I do want to move there. The big change that coincided with the spike during the Biden years, during the border crisis crisis then was a change towards short-form video technology. Because now all of a sudden, if you can see what life is like in our country in a short-form video, that inspires a lot more mimetic desire. Because then all of a sudden you can think, oh, well, I saw a video of a guy who I tangentially sort of knew, who's now living in the United States as an asylum seeker. His life seems pretty good because he's posting videos only of the good parts of it. So on the one hand, it inspires more migration from countries that we otherwise had not seen that much migration from. So middle-income countries with middle-class population that had access to technology and enough money to actually make the journey, because these journeys are expensive, anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 in some cases. We saw massive increases from China, from Russia, from India, from Turkey, for example, and those short-form video technology also allowed people to stay ahead of different interception points, because now all of a sudden, it's basically almost like a how-to on TikToks on how to actually get through the Darien Gap, for example. So the thing that we are now on the cusp of is what artificial intelligence does to that, and what the revolution in artificial intelligence is going to actually do. Every single time we've seen these changes, I think it's taken border security apparatuses across the region a time to catch up. There's always an offense-defense advantage. And I think that we have yet to see, really, because of the suppressed period we're currently in, how artificial intelligence is actually going to help migrants come here, how it's going to help smugglers, for example, also be more effective. As an early sign of this, one of the things I was looking at in preparation for this panel was the difference in the interception rates between Mexico's INM and US Customs and Border Protection at the border. Historically speaking, throughout most of the border crisis that we had in the past year, the ratio was about 2 to 1. So for every 1 encounter that the Mexican INM had, the Border Patrol had about 2 encounters. Even though numbers have gone down, that ratio is now 8 to 1. So for every 1 encounter that Mexico has, we now have 8 encounters. That indicates to me that people are actually, even though the numbers are suppressed, you can argue there are some demographic things. Also, there are some other factors that could explain this, but that indicates to me that people who are still coming are actually getting more effective at actually evading Mexican enforcement in the first place, which could be a sign of things to come if indeed the current situation is not tenable.
Okay, I've been nodding along to a lot of what you said, because some of my work also looks at how technologies are exploited for malevolent reasons, and unfortunately that is sometimes very dark. I do want to emphasize that a lot of technologies, I mean social media companies, but also AI, it's developing, and when there is really good public-private partnership and cooperation, then actually we can rein in some of the harmful uses, but there are plenty of them out there, so we really need to be on top of it. Okay, we've touched on a lot, organized crime, technology. I want to go back to something that has come up a couple of times, like it needs cooperation, better organization, better working together. So maybe back to you, Betilde. Based on like what we've said so far, how can receiving and transit countries be best supported with public policies to address migration flows?
Excellent question, and I would think, one of the things I always say that there's, and those who are trying to understand migration patterns, there's a tension between protecting national security and protecting the rights of people on the move, and every country, resolves that tension the best way they can, based on, of course, the social pact. But what we propose at the OAS is that, again, as I said earlier, protecting the rights of the migrants, ensuring that there are ways for them to have incentives to migrate regularly is also part of a good national security strategy. Now, there's many benefits for receiving countries in terms of knowing who is coming to the country. You were saying that amongst families and children, there's some other elements that people who come that have other intentions and definitely can represent a national security risk. But if you create channels, you create asylum systems, and you create possibilities of knowing who is coming into the country, you are able to separate those and give protections to those who legitimately need protection. There's also the element of ensuring that people who have an intention to move do not rely and depend on smugglers to be able to do this, but can do this on their own accord and using legal pathways. And then the importance of generating social inclusion policies when they arrive. I always say that our capacity as countries to take advantage of migration is directly proportional to the policies that we develop. So in that regard, I just wanted to mention, as you were asking, Inga, the importance of exchanging lessons learned and providing platforms for countries to exchange. We have very good examples in the region in terms of the regional cooperation on migration. Of course, I will talk about the OAS, the Organization of American States, is the host of the Committee on Migratory Affairs, where officials and other policymakers meet and discuss whatever practices are working in terms of handling migration and other forms of responses. There's Proceso de Quito, the Quito process that was also an emergence of the as a response, let's say, to the increasing migrants from Venezuela throughout the region. And I have to say that was kind of a point of inflection in terms of creating more innovative ways to respond to migration. And I'm referring to the Venezuelan migration system, right? We're talking about over 8 million people who had to leave the country. And what this did is force the countries of the region to create responses that could be able to manage the arrivals. We have very interesting experiences in terms of legal pathways, and they were practiced, of course, during the height of the Venezuelan migration system. Colombia, that hosts the highest number of Venezuelans outside of Venezuela, developed a transitory regime or a temporary protected status in order to allow them to stay in the country and work and be able to contribute. But other countries of the region did that too. And at some point, we had a very nice rhythm of cooperation happening amongst countries of the region.
Yes.
Around the Summit of the Americas, there was also an interesting proposal in order to take the best and really promote the learning amongst the countries in terms of what they were implementing. The other element that I would also ask is in terms of institutional coordination, because we're talking about the migrants who arrive and have different needs in terms of health, access to jobs, access to schooling, right? And there was very interesting responses happening in the region, and again, uneven within countries, uneven amongst countries, but a lot of interesting experiences happening that could definitely be part, and hopefully they will continue to be part of regional conversations.
Mm-hmm. Adam, I'm going to give it to you because you've already been eager to confirm. Is there something you want to add? I was also thinking,
what this looks like.
We've already mentioned this. I think many of you like the current drop, like the sharp drop in arrivals at the US-Mexico border, right? That we had over, last year. So maybe you can talk about that. Is that actually a success in terms of migration policy? Is that part of cooperation? Is that like unilateral policy, but successful unilateral border policy? Maybe you just explain it to us.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of people in both parties here in the United States think that when there are fewer migrants, fewer protection-seeking migrants showing up, that is a success. And certainly it seems like the polls reflect that attitude as well. But is fewer people coming to seek protection a success, especially if those people needed it? Now, looking at data from our immigration court system, during the Biden administration, about 50% of asylum cases that made it through the court system, tens of thousands of people a year, were granted asylum or protection, which meant that those immigration judges thought, according to their stringent guidelines, that if those people were sent back to their country of origin, there was a very good chance they could have been killed. So the fact that we're blocking those people is not necessarily a success. The question is more, are a lot of migrants coming to seek protection, or are a lot of migrants coming to seek protection, or more than coming to seek protection, than we have put in place the capacity to adjudicate, to manage the cases, and to process? Does it automatically become chaos? And that, if you phrase the question that way, is it just more than we put in place the infrastructure to handle? then the question is, the answer to that really is, well, why haven't we put in place the infrastructure to handle that, especially at a moment in the 2010s and since of the Haiti earthquake, Cuba doing away with exit visas, the big spike in gang activity and homicide rates in the Northern Triangle of Central America, the collapse of Venezuela, the pandemic. Of course you would need more capacity. And what that capacity would largely do, a lot of that is adjudicating, so that you wouldn't have these 5-year backlogs of people admitted with an asylum case that hasn't been tried before, tried at all, given a work permit. They're taking videos, sending them back home looking, hey man, I'm here with a work permit and my court date isn't even until 2031, look at me. Some of those cases are very valid, as I said, but some of them are not, and that backlog becomes its own draw. Why didn't the United States invest more? The Biden administration started to, but really didn't do this aggressively. Invest more in processing coordinators, in case managers, in asylum officers, and of course in immigration judges. It would have cost a tiny fraction of what just went through in the Big Beautiful Bill Act to build walls and detention centers, a tiny fraction, but it wasn't done. And that's largely a question of political will. It would not have required a fundamental change in the law. If I can just say one thing on cooperation, because it comes from that. If there is a country that's blocking protection-seeking migration, and there is another country that is developing their asylum system or their protection system, like Colombia has done, like to some extent Mexico and Costa Rica have done. If there's a country that is blocking or detaining and deporting like crazy, and then there's another country that is registering people and has well-funded integration programs. If there's a country, which country is going to get the larger burden, and which country is almost going to be rewarded by not having to even invest in handling that shock? And there are going to be shocks. Yes, the numbers are down now, but the climate's changing. There's natural disasters. There could be new social breakdowns or large economic crises. We're going to see more migratory waves, some of it protection seeking and some of it otherwise, and countries are going to have to sort it out. But the countries that aren't cooperating almost come out ahead under the current regime, and we need to change that. I think the Los Angeles declaration process that happened under the Biden administration was an important step toward that coordination. It was slow. It was obviously abandoned in January of 2025. But it was at least a move toward that cooperation, but it depended heavily on US assistance, mainly through population, refugees, and migration, and through USAID, 2 bureaus or agencies that barely exist anymore.
Can I react very briefly? We were going to be technical secretariat.
That's right, you were.
Yes,
yeah.
to that process. But I just wanted to take the point on political will. I mean, everything that you're explaining is really a matter of political will, and I wanted to use the example of Costa Rica. We at the OAS developed Costa Rica is a country that welcomes and is willing to establish all the processes in order to respond respectfully and with dignity to the arrival of migrants and refugees. They reached out to the OAS because they had a backlog also of around 7 years in terms of processing asylum applications. A statistic that we're talking about people, human stories behind those, that backlog. But the number or the time in terms of processing increased after the 2018 crisis in Nicaragua that caused around hundreds of Nicaraguans moving, putting additional pressures on the asylum system in Costa Rica. So they realized, they did the numbers, it's 7 years that it takes us in order for us to adjudicate a case. What can we do? And with international cooperation, also learning from other countries that had interesting exercises in terms of asylum recognition and processing of these cases, they established a digital platform in order to facilitate the submission of supporting documentation as well as processing all the different steps in order to get to the adjudication of the case. And this is already helping respond in a more timely manner to the requests from these asylum seekers.
Yeah, this is exactly what we need, concrete examples, and I think that you line out. Thank you. Gil, I want you to maybe piggyback off what Adam said, but take a bit of a bigger picture in terms of how durable do you think the current decline in border encounters is, and what does this decline force us to reconsider about long-standing assumptions in immigration policy?
Sure. Just to sort of respond, I suppose, first, or maybe I'll talk about the durability first. I think that it is correct that this is all a matter of political will. There was a breaking story today here in Florida, for example, of the latest detention camp, which may shut down due to costs, which some of you may have seen. So I think it's a problem that both sides have as far as how far they'll take their priorities. I think one of the real challenges with asylum is the fact that it is, for all intents and purposes, it's become a humanitarian pathway that is being used to process a population that I would argue is pretty clearly motivated by economic reasons and rationales. The 50% number that Adam cited, for example, of cases that actually get to court comes from cases that were stronger because they actually made it to the courts in the first place. If you look at the overall rates, I think that there's now widespread consensus, even among people on the left, like the Center for American Progress, that a lot of the people coming to seek asylum, and you can have sympathy for them. I certainly have tremendous sympathy for the people coming from Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Haiti, and so on. But the fact remains that the explosion that we saw was because it was primarily people who were taking advantage of the humanitarian system, whose goals were overwhelmingly to come here. Yes, they may have been fleeing hardships in their home countries, but fundamentally the goal for why would you come to the United States instead of, say, stopping in Mexico, stopping in any of the other countries that you passed through the way here, was because there's greater economic opportunity here. And on the one hand, you can't begrudge people for that, but this question of whether or not having lower numbers at the border is actually a sign of a better border policy. I mean, I would argue that it is, even if you were to take the extreme view that 100% of the people coming to the border are actually genuine asylum seekers. The southern border is not where we should be adjudicating our global humanitarian obligations. There are other ways that we can do this. There are better ways that we can do this. This is what, in many cases, the refugee processing system was for. I think this is, there's constantly this push and pull, I think, between the right and the left in this country, where people on the right want there to be, lower numbers first, you build capacity, and then you kind of wait. People on the left, I think, tend to have more of an inclination towards wanting people to, be able to come and claim asylum regardless of it. But I think that really what it comes down to is how you actually address that particular population. And one of the things I think has made asylum so controversial, has caused it to lose a lot of its popular support, is the fact that people understand, increasingly in both parties, that the way that it has been used historically has been abused. And I think that any kind of notion that a border that has, say, 10,000 encounters a month is somehow less secure or less effective than a border that has 100,000 average encounters per month is one that I don't agree with.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Adam, concretely.
Very, very, very quickly. Two things.
No, this is really important.
On the 50% number, you're right. My ears perked up in 2023 in the appropriations hearing when Senator Lindsey Graham asked Alejandro Mayorkas, then the Secretary of DHS, counting all the cases about how many do actually end up with grants of asylum. And Mayorkas said 25%, which is far lower, but that's not a needle in a haystack. That's still a lot of people who could die if we sent them back, and that's an argument for more adjudication capacity. I also agree with you, though, that asylum is a terrible way to handle protection seeking or any other migration. It requires people to run this whole gauntlet of organized crime, get across Mexico and somehow set foot on US soil. Asylum is like basically a refugee status, but you're not invited to a refugee program. You have to stand on US soil, and that's super dangerous, and it doesn't make sense. It's more a reflection. So we've got two problems here. One, we have immigration laws that haven't been changed since 1990, really, in terms of who gets to apply and how the process works, which has made asylum like the only way in for so many people who have no other way to qualify. And then, of course, we just have no way. If we can't change those laws, and we're deadlocked right now, there's asylum sitting there as one way, and then we didn't bother to invest in the adjudication capacity. So two political will problems.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to just react to what was said. You were saying how the left and the right see the issue, and I understand. I mean, this is part of the dynamics of everyday politics in any country of the region. Mm-hmm. But of course, from the standpoint of the OAS, we want to just go to the principles, how to protect those who need protection, right. And how do we create systems that allow to in the best way possible reconciliate, is that the conciliate all of the, demands that a political system has. So I just wanted to point that out. And earlier during the day, we were discussing the issue of communication, right? And I can't remember if it was the first or the second panel. And I wanted to bring the case of Canada and how interesting, in the case of Canada, we see that communities, Canadians themselves, organize in order to receive asylum, or those who have been granted asylum and make them part of their communities. We were in a big discussion maybe a couple of years ago, and to me at least it was very interesting to see like a good synergies happening between government, academia, and the media, right? In the sense that academia is constantly documenting and finding evidence where Canadians can see the benefits of having these asylum seekers be part of their communities and contribute with businesses and so many different things. And this is used by government, by the government, and also in coordination with the media to change the narratives about migration. No? And I connected all back to the dichotomy between the left and the right and the issue of migration. When we have information, when we have evidence, when we're effective in communicating the contributions and the benefits of migrants and refugees, we have a different conversation, hopefully more elevated conversation regarding policies.
And what I hear from what you're saying is a really proactive approach, right?
Yes.
So I want to push you a bit more, like why is a purely restrictive policy towards managing migration, et cetera, not the right response? Maybe.
Yeah, very briefly, just to say, and it's been kind of like what we've been saying, restrictive policies in a way treat, let's use a health analogy, the symptoms of the issue, right? The manifestation of the issue, but we need to address why people move. As long as these issues continue, we're going to have to continue seeing people migrating throughout the region. This is going to continue happening. So how do we work from a multidimensional approach with countries of origin and then all the rest, but also countries of origin especially? And I'll talk about the case of the biggest migration system in the region, which is the Venezuelan migration system. If you are able, I'm not saying that it's going to be magical and automatic, but you have to address the reasons why people are moving in the case of Venezuela as well as the others. And in the sense that I'm not saying that the countries should not exercise border control and policies, at the borders, and that have to be restricted, that have to involve security forces, right, in terms of managing this, but is insufficient. We need the other element, how to address root causes, how to provide asylum to those who need it. Once they're in, how do we integrate them into the communities? How do we talk about it? What evidence do we use in order to again, change the narrative so that this is positive for the country that is receiving?
So I see the clock is ticking, which is unfortunate. So I'm going to ask the last question to all three of you, and this is really your moment where you can also get in something that you think I've missed in asking and that you just want everyone's attention to be on. But my question, the last one for the panel, would be which emerging trends in irregular migration most deserve policymakers' attention right now? Gil.
Sure. Well, I'll start by just throwing out another kind of polemical point, perhaps, to my two colleagues here on my left. If you look at the things that have actually managed to change and decrease border encounter numbers, and I'm talking towards the United States, obviously there's been redirection around the region. If you chronologically go through, you can look at the things that have actually made a difference have been the election of Raul Mulino in Panama, who had much more of an enforcement style policy towards the Darien. The outgoing president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in January of 2024, redirecting millions of dollars towards migrant flights, migrant budgets. You can look at the executive order that former President Biden put in force in July 2024, restricting asylum at the border. And you can also look at, obviously, the policies put forth by the Trump administration in January of 2025. You may not like any of those policies, but so far, the only things that we've seen that actually meaningfully and quickly decrease border encounter numbers have been enforcement. One of the things I think is a challenge for the root causes framework generally is that, one, the time horizon that it operates in is too long to actually have any kind of immediate significant impact in the way that, say, enforcement is able to actually do. Two, I think that, as I mentioned, a lot of the things that are actually driving people to move cannot be solved by the kinds of root causes, giving aid style of approach. I think it's arguable whether or not you can actually solve some of these problems just by giving aid or by having bilateral cooperation. I like both of those things. I think they're both well and good. But the fact of the matter is, one of the reasons that many people move here is also because they have a family member here. I don't know how much money it would take for you to never live or see your family again, for example, but if you already have a family member in the US, you can't really, root causes fix that and give people enough money to actually replace that. And the last thing I would say is, I think that because that enforcement policy is actually managed to have some sort of effect, I think that it also is a challenge for this kind of approach, which has, comparatively, doesn't have as concrete results, however noble its fundamental causes may be. Quickly on what kind of trends you mentioned, I would refer back to my initial comments, which are that I think extra-hemispheric migration is growing at a very rapid pace. It's actually been very resilient. If you look at the number of extra-hemispheric migrants, in 2021, it was at about 7%. Throughout most of the border crisis, it was about 11%. Currently, as a share, it's actually gone up. It's now currently around 15 or 16%, depending on how you measure it at the southern border, for example. I think that's a trend that is going to continue to grow. And a problem that we're going to have is that our system, as Adam mentioned, was created in 1990. The way that we have thought about border protections throughout most of the recent period is one that was really designed to deal with single Mexican men who were traveling for economic purposes on a seasonal basis. And the question of how we adapt that system to one where all of a sudden you have people coming from all over the world where they can't easily be returned, repatriated from where they are, I think that makes a challenge of, okay, well, even if 25% of them genuinely have humanitarian concerns, what do you do with the 75% who are actually much more difficult to return in the event that they lose their asylum appeals? I think that's a long-term challenge that we also have to face.
And then, of course, you wanted to say technology is very important to watch as well. Yes. Adam.
In terms of trends, I can do this in 1 minute. I have my eye on the sending countries. What's going to happen? Because I know I just said that, yes, there's going to be a big increase in migration eventually again, but for a few years, it's very likely that migration is going to be at the near halt that it has been at lately. What does that mean for countries that are super dangerous, have a lot of crime and insecurity, or are repressive? In the past, people who were fleeing danger could leave. People who were unemployed or poor could leave. People who were dissidents could leave. That actually was a boon for the state in those countries because they didn't have to bother to govern their country and they didn't have to democratize. Now, all those would-be dissidents and fleeing people and poor people and unemployed people are going to stay. But there's more, right? Because we're entering a period of mass deportation. The numbers are only starting to go up. The numbers right now are mostly people who spent years in the United States now and not recent border crossers, people with fewer roots, unemployed, homeless, being added to the population of these countries that already have these social problems at the same time. At the same time as that, we're starting to see it in the data, and then we may see it more. As there are fewer migrants here, there will be less remittances, which will deal another economic blow to these countries. So no safety valve, more unemployed people, less remittances. That's a pressure cooker, and we could see some, what in Spanish we say, estallidos sociales, resulting from this around the region.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
Okay,
I subscribe to what was said. I would maybe add three. First one that I would say, in terms of trends, the feminization of migration, because what we're seeing, we used to see more men traveling and then the women joining, and what we're seeing in recent times is women pretty much migrating at the same rate as men, 50-50 participation in migration processes, with the specific vulnerabilities and nuances in terms of migrating in these awful routes as a woman. We know that 70-some% of victims of human trafficking are women and children. So, it requires different policy responses on the part of transit countries as well as destination countries. The second issue that I would add to what was excellently said, you already mentioned, is the extra continental or extra regional migration, from people from all other continents, and the particular demands that requires. We were talking about sometimes the absence of consular services, servicios consulares, the fact that maybe these countries, transit as well as destination countries, don't have the languages to process the request of these people. And then sometimes, as you were saying at the beginning of your remarks, the incapacity of countries knowing who they are and what intentions really they have as they come to the country. So that would be the second one, extra-regional migration. And the last one, again, tying it to what you just recently said, the absence of very well-polished return migration policies. And now we're talking about countries that receive migrants that go back either voluntarily or involuntarily due to deportation proceedings. We have a couple of countries like Mexico, El Salvador, that have developed very interesting policies of return migration, how to receive them in the country, how to connect them to jobs, how to give a birth certificate to the kids who were born in another country, how to teach these kids, if they're teenagers, the language of the country that they're from. All, these are details, but this have to be part of return migration policies, and we are not very developed in the region in terms of that, except for the cases that I mentioned. So I would add those three.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think my German side of the family would be proud. We ended like almost perfectly on time. Big thank you to our panel.